Let's have a closer look at DaVinci Resolve's caching capabilities. So Resolve automatically can render out processing intensive parts of your timeline and render them to disk, and then reuse those renderings during your editing work and further processing down the line. There is a level of different cachings which starts with fusion and then goes to color caching on different levels, and some sequence caching inside the edit page as well. I will discuss those different levels, in which order they are processed, what is happening automatically, what you can trigger manually, and so on. So all of this coming now. This is the fourth tutorial in a series of performance related topics that I'm covering. The first one was about codecs, how codecs impact performance. Then the second one about optimized media and proxy media. I then discussed how resolution is managed in Resolve and how that impacts your work. And now this is potentially the final tutorial in this series about cache levels. So let's have a look. I have a timeline set up with a few different effects. There's a little bit of color grading on some clips of different types. There are some OFX effects and fusion effects thrown on top, and something done in fusion on this clip, like a bunch of completely different stuff. Nothing really for any particular purpose other than demonstrating the caching feature. So let me turn it on. First of all, under playback, you see here you have the render cache. So this is what I'm talking about. And you have three different levels: none, smart, and user. Let me actually start with smart, which is, I think, what most people do. This means let Resolve decide what to cache. So this is a good starting point. And well, let's see what is happening when I turn this on. And you see that different blue segments here appear. They're blue because I already had it on once before, and it is being cached in the background. When it's blue, it means the cache is active, and now I am actually having playback from the cache. So everything here that is blue should play back fluently no matter what effect is happening underneath. If you are turning it on for the first time, or if you have deleted any, let me delete one. I can delete a single clip or multiple. I can select a few clips, go to playback, delete render cache, and you can delete all the ones that is not used in the project at the moment, or you can delete for selected ones. So in this case, I delete for the selected ones, and you see those are now being rebuilt, and while Resolve is idle, after a short time it starts in the background to render those effects here until they are blue again. If you play back, or if you're working, it will stop the rendering and will resume whenever you're doing this. So this is the default behavior. So let's see what is actually being captured by this smart cache. The first clip here, there is no effect at all on this, but this is a Blackmagic RAW clip, so it's raw media. Raw media is potentially processing intensive, and that is why this is one type of media which is automatically caught and cached by the smart setting. So raw media, H264, H265, JPEG 2000, I think. So there are just a few codecs which are not very editing friendly generally, but intend to be processor intensive, and those codecs are being used by the smart cache and automatically being selected. Here I have a title effect, title effects and fusion title effects. They are also used and being cached here. There's a transition effect. It's not a fusion transition, it's a regular transition, doesn't matter. Transitions are by default cached. Here I have a edit composite, so I have two clips on top of each other, and because both clips are being seen at the same time, both of them need to be like processed and loaded at the same time, and this is also a scenario which the smart cache covers. If I change the size of this, you see if I make it larger like this, suddenly the cache disappears because now only one clip is being used, only one clip needs to be displayed, and only one is being played back. But if you have this kind of compositing scenario due to size or due to transparency of any type, or different apply modes in compositing, if you're familiar with this, even in the edit page you have these composite modes. If you use anything other than normal, then there's a combination of foreground and background. That would also trigger the smart cache. The next clip here, there is actually nothing happening here, even though there's clearly an effect on it. This is a simple color grading effect, nothing processing intensive, just a color offset, nothing else. No OFX, no noise removal or anything that would be processor intensive, and by default this is not being cached. So not all color grading is being cached. So simple things like simple primary corrections are typically left alone. The next one here is again a color grading effect, but this time the color grading uses a noise removal on this node. So there is a noise removal, temporal noise removal, and this or noise reduction, and this is quite processing intensive. So this is automatically being cached. So this is why this clip has a blue line. So even among color grading effects, it depends on the effect. This one here is again not being cached. This one has different effects placed on top. In the inspector you can see them. If I select this, you see there is a fusion effect, which is this drone overlay, and an OpenFX effect, and nonetheless nothing is being cached, even though there's both fusion and a potentially processing intensive color grading effect. And the reason is that those pasted on fusion and OFX effects in the timeline are not automatically caught independent of what they are. So if you need to cache this effect, you need to do it manually. I will come to this, just be aware of it. And last part, this fusion effect here is built just by going on clip level to fusion. So just do something in fusion, whatever it is, and the output will automatically be again selected for smart caching. Let me quickly go to the settings and show you where the settings are. In the master settings of your project settings, you find the cache format, which tells you which file format is being used. So in this case, it's a DNxHR 4x4 clip. I have discussed codecs in a separate video, but just super quick orientation if you haven't seen it. So basically, if you go from, ignore the GoPro ones, if you go from here upwards, it goes from lowest quality to higher quality, and your disk space requirement will increase and processing requirement will increase as you go up, but your quality will increase as well. If you are on Mac, you will see ProRes instead of the DNX, but you have pretty much a similar type of codecs. Very good for editing. The lowest ones are enough if you just do editing. The highest ones are more suitable if you also want to do color grading and want to do accurate color judgment on your cache. So if you have a level of caching and then want to evaluate it for color grading, want to continue working on it, or potentially even render from the cache, which is possible, then you need like the higher levels, potentially the highest level of quality here to do that. Where do you find those files? So you find them in this folder location. Here you can overwrite it, can choose a different location. Generally, if you haven't done anything here, it will put in this field, it will put the default path based on your first storage media location in the DaVinci Resolve general settings. I have mentioned it before in the other tutorials, so just quick repetition. More interesting now are these checkboxes here. This is now really specific to the caching. The rest is also applicable for optimized media and so on. Quite the same principle. Here you can decide when the caching starts. So if Resolve is idle, it will start after so and so many seconds to fill up the cache while you are on break or whatever. And the checkboxes underneath are all specific to the user mode. So far I enabled the smart mode and have shown you what is all being done in the smart mode. In the user mode, by default, only the fusion effects are being cached unless you enable more of them here in the settings. Let me actually enable the other ones as well to show you something. So let me enable those, the transitions and composites, and save. These are edit page composites. So let me switch to user cache and show you what I mean. Render cache user. And now you see, after waiting a second, some disappear, some remain. So the fusion effects remain because the fusion checkbox was on. This is a fusion effect and this is a fusion title. So this one also remains. The transition remains because I enabled transition, and this one remains because I enabled composite. For the rest, it is now all turned off. With the composite, so this is the edit page composite, right? This is being cached because edit page composites were now selected for the user mode. For these, you actually have on track level a setting once you are in user mode and have these checkboxes that I just showed you activated. Then if you right click on your track, you can here exclude track from caching. This is a feature which only appears if those checkboxes are set and you are in user mode. If I exclude those, and again wait a second, you will see that the composite is no longer being cached. The fusion effects are still being cached, but the composite not, because I excluded this on track level, so it will decide for the whole track whether or not those overlays and composites should be cached or not. Could be helpful if you have like multiple tracks and maybe one track which you don't really use or disable all the time, or have just some overlays which maybe for specific purposes, but you do lots of changes underneath and don't want it to recache all the time. So effects happen, the caching happens on top. This one here is actually the last level of caching. So the composite is the last thing that happens in the edit page. Other things like color grading, fusion happens before. So the caching happens like on top of each other. So each cache level takes the previous cache into account to build the next one. So I should review this a little bit, and let's start from the beginning. The first level in the total hierarchy is the fusion cache. So in this case here, this one is a fusion clip, and this is the first thing that Resolve can capture in the cache. It is called a fusion output cache. It captures whatever is happening in fusion and anything that may have happened before. In this case here, I am in user mode, but I can enable the fusion output cache, turn it on, and you will see that this clip is now also being cached, even though nothing happened in fusion, but it will cache. It's called fusion output cache, but it caches everything that happens before in the sequence. And one thing that happens before is the raw media debayering in this case. So it will cache that. So in this case, it will cache because of the codec of the raw media debayering. You could also have what happens before fusion is the debayering decoding. This is one step that happens before fusion, and superscale in DaVinci Resolve. If you do anything on clip level attribute here, the superscale here especially, so this will also be caught by the first cache level, which is just called fusion cache. This cache level, if you are using Resolve for a longer time, this is now called fusion output. It used to be called source cache. So before version 16, I think, this was called source cache. And once fusion got integrated, they changed the name, but the principle is still the same. It's the first level. If you want to cache your decoding, that will happen there, and fusion will happen there. This is the first level. After this, you can have caching from the Resolve FX and OFX, which happens in the edit page. This is what's happening in this clip, and it was not caught by the smart cache. The only way to activate caching on this is always to do it manually. You right click, and on this one here you see render cache OFX filter and render cache fusion effect filter. So the fusion effect is being processed before the OpenFX effect. So in the effects category, you see first fusion here, first in the order, first fusion. So there's the drone overlay, and you see the drone overlay is under these color swatches, which is the OpenFX color palette, which I put on top of the fusion effect. So this is just the order how the effects are being applied. And this is also the order of caching. So if I enable this cache and enable the OFX filter color palette, you will see after a short time that the cache is being built up. And now, because this is the last effect that is being cached, this cache will include everything that happened before. So it will include the fusion effect. It will include if there was fusion processing on the clip itself, or the decoding, debayering, anything that happens before is now being caught and being rendered together. That means I can now do on top of this, I could do, for example, color grading. And let's just do something stupid. This happens on top of it now. This did not invalidate the cache because this itself, this green effect, is a color grading effect which doesn't require caching, neither in user nor in smart mode. But everything underneath is being cached, and this cache is still valid and still being used, even though I did a little bit of color correction on top of it. That part did not invalidate the cache. But if I do something before this effect that should invalidate the cache, so for example, if I go into the fusion section here and now let's say I disable this, now you see I disabled the fusion effect and the later cache, the OpenFX cache, needs to be rebuilt because something underneath in the order of caching got changed. So the last cache level needs to be rebuilt from whatever was there before. So I think this illustrates quite well how you move like from one cache level to the next. If you want, you could enable both. So let's enable this effect again and do the fusion effect as well. So I could enable this one and for a second disable the color palette here. So now it would just need to cache the fusion effect. And once that is done, as long as I don't change the fusion effect and don't change anything underneath, that cache level would be remain intact. And I could use this cache level while using my OFX. So I have now fast playback on the fusion effect. I can, while having fast playback from the fusion effect, I can adjust my OFX effect, turn this one on, and do now adjustments on this effect. And it is using the cache level underneath to build the next cache level. And once that is completed, I have the highest level again active. Right? All right, so in the sequence so far, Fusion output caching, which includes the source media caching, then the Fusion FX and OpenFX caching, which you can only trigger manually. It does never happen automatically, no matter the project settings. After that, there is color page node-based caching. So in the color page, let me go to the color page, I can manually decide to cache a node. You can right-click on it, and you have here a node cache, which is set to auto. And if it's set to auto, it will not cache like simple primary corrections, things that don't need a lot of processing. But if you want to override it, you can manually turn it on. Let me add another node, and let's do something which is processor intensive. A typical example, denoise of any type. Let's do a bit of denoise on effect number 2. So there's now a noise reduction. This node is now more processor intensive, and that means that automatically in the color page a node level cache should kick in, and we can see that if I go on the, so this is called auto, sorry, I'm in user mode, so in user mode it doesn't automatically kick in, but I can activate it manually, or I can go to smart mode again. Let me switch back to the smart mode in the render cache here. And now in smart mode, you see that the number here gets red, and this is the color indicator that there is a cache which currently is not yet fully computed. And you see also here on the red line above the timeline, the same indicator as you have from the edit page, which says there's something that needs to be cached. And the last one, the last cache level I have now here is the color page node-based cache for this node, because this node is processor intensive. If I don't want it, I can overwrite it here and can turn it off. And now you see the number 2 is no longer red because I'm no longer waiting for a cache. And also my line down here got instantly blue because there was a cache level before, which was the OFX output cache, which I manually activated. That one was already computed. I'm going back to that one because I'm not using this at the moment. So this is how node level caching works. You can then have multiple nodes in the color page that each can have their cache. Quite common to do it for noise reduction, so some people put the noise reduction as the very first node and then cache it and then let the rest use the rest for quick grading without caching. Potentially for other OFX, if you do things like, I don't know, phase refinement or something else that is more processor intensive, those OFX will also trigger the smart cache, or you can manually enable it again here, manually turn it on. After those individual color page node level cache scenarios here, there is an overall color grading cache. That is again on the edit page, and that you can capture if you do a right click here and enable the render cache color output. So this will encapsulate everything that has been done on the color page, whether or not it by itself triggered the smart cache. So no matter what I do, this will be an overall cache for the whole color page. So including now the node with the denoise where I intentionally disabled it on node level, but this will still be included now because now I'm just saying take everything from the color page as my highest level of caching so far. And the only caching that will happen after that, so this is the last level from the color page, the only one that happens after that is a cache called sequence cache. That is what is happening here. And if I move this over here, it would be happening here. So this composite now, this is being cached after the color page cache. Also, transition effects would happen in this so-called sequence cache, and retime effects on the edit page will also happen there. So this is the highest level, the sequence cache. This no longer can be triggered on clip level. So user mode, smart mode doesn't matter. There's no option to enable or disable this except this track level option that I have shown you before in user mode. In smart mode, it will be always there. So in smart mode, I can't disable this. I can't remove this. This is always there in smart mode. If I switch again to user mode, going back to user mode, then it depends on these checkboxes, and if it's enabled here, you can still disable it here, but these are the only places to trigger it. So I cannot go on clip level and enable or disable it anywhere here. On clip level, I can have the overall fusion output, the color output, and in between fusion and color, the fusion FX and OFX parts, which you saw on this clip. Now this clip has pretty much everything, and it has everything in, well, here it's not in sequence. So first fusion output, then fusion effects, then OFX, then color output, and then at the very end, the edit page compositing, retime effects, and edit page transitions. So that's the sequence of all caching there is in DaVinci Resolve. Okay, I hope that clarified those little blue and red lines a bit and makes it clearer why the cache is sometimes triggered, sometimes not, and why it sometimes needs reprocessing and sometimes not, and so on. It is a little bit complex, but there is a logical sequence, and if you're familiar with it, it is quite manageable and understandable. So this was the last performance-related tutorial in the series. In case you have watched all 4 of them and feel there is something that I haven't covered or something that's missing, then let me know, and perhaps I will add tutorial number 5 to this performance series in DaVinci Resolve. Otherwise, like and subscribe as always if you haven't done already, and have a look at my website for my training courses, especially if you are into Fusion. I'd be happy to see you in one of the courses, and otherwise see you again in one of the next tutorials. Thanks. Cheers.